Let me first welcome everybody for joining us here tonight. We've got an exciting evening planned with Jack Davis. Jack is the author of The Gulf, The Making of American Sea, and I think most of you know that he was scheduled to visit us in person in March, on March 23rd. And so what we've decided to do tonight is we're still intending to have Jack come visit us. Jack lives in Florida. He was going to be kind enough to come visit us in Texas. He's obviously spent time here before. And so tonight is sort of a teaser. It's a brief discussion with Jack about his book, about some of the things in his book. But really, we want to have the full presentation. Zoom just can't do it justice. So we're hopeful that Jack will be able to come visit us in person again, whether it's this fall or next spring or sometime down the road. But we just wanted to do something, a smaller version of it tonight. So, Jack, thank you so much for joining us tonight. Just in terms of housekeeping on this Zoom presentation, again, we had probably 100 people or so register. So for that reason, we've got everybody on mute, and you're unable to turn your mute off. We have controls here if for some reason we needed to do that, but generally speaking, we're going to keep people quiet. Jack's going to talk for maybe 30 minutes or so, and we'll have time for 15 minutes, give or take, of question and answer at the end. We're going to do the question and answer by the chat feature on the Zoom. So if you're on a laptop or a desktop, you can use your cursor to have the items displayed at the bottom of your screen, and you can just hit chat and type it into everyone. If you're using a tablet or an iPhone, I think you sort of have to swipe screens until you see the chat button, but it should be pretty similar in some fashion. Also, you're free to keep your screen however you like it, but it probably makes the most sense to just keep it on speaker view. So you see the folks who are talking, and rather than staring at a bunch of faces of people who might be out there, but I'll leave that up to you. So I think that's it. I'm reachable by cell phone for folks who know my number. If for some reason you need to text me about anything, we've got some staff members who are unmuted as well. I think Nicole and Claire are both unmuted. Claire Everett, who's our communications and marketing director, is going to run the question and answer through the chat. So we just wanted to say, if you have questions, feel free to type them into the chat right now. We won't get to them until probably 30 minutes from now, but rather than forget your question down the road, feel free to type it into chat, and we'll do our best to answer all the questions we can. So that's it for the annual meeting introduction. Dr. Jack Davis, Professor Davis, is with us from Florida tonight. I thought I'd rather have him kind of give a little bit of background on who he is rather than read some long bio, but we really are incredibly privileged and thankful to have you join us here tonight, Jack. Thank you for your perspective on the Gulf. All of our little estuaries make up a little piece of the Gulf, but the Gulf is this big body of water out there that we're totally connected to. So would you mind starting with just a little bit of background about yourself, and we'd love to listen.
Oh, sure. And thank you for having me. I'm sorry I'm not there in person. I was looking forward to coming out. And I've given, interestingly, since the Gulf book came out in March 2017, I've given some 120 talks, and only one has been on the Texas coast. And that was when the book first came out, and I was invited to give a talk at Bradlow's Books in Houston.
Okay.
But even though I have only been to the Texas coast once since the book came out, I've been to Austin 5 times. So it was nice to get an invitation from you guys, and we tried to do something a year earlier, and I don't remember the circumstances behind that, but it may have been my schedule didn't allow something. But in any case, I'm looking forward to coming to the Houston-Galveston area again. So a little bit about myself. I'm a professor of history at the University of Florida, and I specialize in environmental history. And so topic-wise, this book fits very nicely with my my specialty. And it is my third solo authored book, but I think my eighth book that I've published. I've co-edited and edited some other books and co-authored another book. And I'm currently writing a book on the natural and cultural history of the bald eagle, and very much enjoying that. And of course, you folks have seen a few of those in your area.
Yeah,
And
more and more. Fortunately, we definitely have bald eagles coming back for sure.
it is really wonderful. And I know this was one of your questions, probably, Bob. I grew up on the Gulf of Mexico, and as a kid, and even as an adult, I never saw bald eagles. And I grew up in Florida, and until maybe the late 80s, but 1990s certainly, and they're coming back in force here. It's a wonderful thing to see. They're very much an indicator species, so they give us a sense of what, and of course they are a water bird or a seabird, and they're part of the sea eagle genus. And so it's great to see them coming back, because they are indeed an indicator species and an indication of how well we're doing, such as your group are doing with these estuarine environments. They'll eat just about anything, but they prefer fish. And they very much enjoy stealing those fish from osprey. Some of you may have witnessed that. I have not had that privilege. But in any case, and why don't I tell you why I decided to write this book? Nobody had written a comprehensive history of the Gulf of Mexico. And so I saw a need there, very much a need there. And I'll explain beyond just a need for, say, the literary catalog or the academic catalog. It goes beyond that. But I had my previous book, or the book prior to the Gulf book, was a biography of Marjorie Stoneman Douglas and the Everglades. So it's a dual biography of both a woman and the place. And I very much enjoyed writing a biography, particularly a biography of a place. And so the Gulf was an ideal place to write about, because nobody had written about it. But also, having grown up on the Gulf of Mexico, I had this lifelong intimacy with the Gulf. And now I live in Gainesville, Florida, and I'm landlocked. For those of you who are not familiar with Florida geography, I'm halfway between the Gulf and halfway between the Atlantic Ocean, and I'm not happy being landlocked as much as I like Gainesville. But I felt that the American image of the Gulf was very limited. First of all, you rarely encounter it in history textbooks, survey histories in the United States. It's perhaps, it may be mentioned in one or two books, but and it's usually not even in the index. So people weren't familiar with Gulf history. What they were familiar with, however, was the BP oil spill, Hurricane Katrina, which before Michael was obviously a big headline maker. Both those events, the BP oil spill and Hurricane Katrina, I believed had robbed the Gulf of its true identity. And so I wanted to restore that identity by writing the history of the Gulf of Mexico. And I always envisioned from the very beginning of writing this book not for an academic audience, but for a general audience. And not just Gulf side residents, but or a regional audience, but a national audience, because I wanted Americans to know that all Americans are connected to the Gulf, both historically and ecologically. And that's really how I framed this book.
Yeah, it's fantastic. You mentioned it, but maybe talk a little bit more about your connection to the Gulf. You said you grew up on the Gulf. Did you grow up somewhere along the actual coast? Spend a ton of time? I know I get that question whenever people ask me, how did I become the director of the Galveston Bay Foundation? What's your connection to Galveston Bay?
Right.
So tell us a little bit more about that.
Yeah, I did. I grew up on the water, first in the Florida Panhandle, and then down in the Tampa Bay area, and so I was engaged in every kind of water sport, it was as I write, I think in the acknowledgments of the book, when I was a kid living in the Panhandle, we lived right on Highway 98, and I didn't live in a baby boom neighborhood, teeming with kids on bicycles and playing baseball and so forth. I was more or less all alone on the water, but that was fine. As I write, the Santa Rosa Sound was my neighborhood, is the cul-de-sac in which I lived. The docks were my sidewalks, and my little boat was my bicycle. My rod and reel were my bat and ball. And I lived in this and even in the late 60s, a very healthy estuarine environment on my end of Santa Rosa Sound. And there weren't very many, as you guys know, around the Gulf in the late 60s, 70s. Many of them are on the verge of ecological death. And at the other end of Santa Rosa Sound, that was the case in Pensacola. I was up in Fort Walton Beach. And so when we moved down to Tampa Bay, we didn't live on the water, but we lived a block from it, and I immediately gravitated to the water. And so I was always on the water. And so being able to write this book was more or less like going back home again. And I traced the origins of the book to my childhood in Fort Walton Beach, living on Santa Rosa Sound. And I didn't know what the hell an estuary was when I was a kid. We weren't taught what an estuary was in school, even though we all lived in Fort Walton Beach. We lived on these wonderful estuaries. And I didn't really learn what an estuary was until I was in college. And I was so glad I did. But here I was. I had an estuary in my backyard. And it was indeed my backyard, the place where I stayed. And as I said, a healthy one, vibrant, never bored on the water, even when I was alone.
Well, I believe it. I mean, it's certainly, you can tell from your writing the passion you have for the Gulf, and clearly there was a lifelong connection there. So thanks for sharing that with us. Yeah. So speaking of origins, early in the book, you spent some time sort of on the origin of the Gulf of Mexico from a geologic standpoint, I guess. Talk to us a little bit about that, and how does it shape the Gulf today?
Well, one thing I like about the origins or the birth of the Gulf of Mexico is that today many consider the Gulf of Mexico as a part of the Atlantic Ocean, a mere appendage of the Atlantic Ocean. And the Gulf started forming with the breakup of the supercontinent of Pangaea. And it's actually older than the Atlantic Ocean. And it's as we know, those of us who are familiar, and all of you are, with the Gulf of Mexico, it really has its own, if natural places can have their own personalities, it really has its own personality. The east coast of Florida, the Atlantic side, is very different from the west coast of Florida. And invariably, people who have spent any sort of time in Florida, who grew up in Florida like myself, have their coastal preferences. And it really has to do with those bodies of water. And so the Gulf originated as a shallow-bodied water. And of course, over the eons, with sea level changes, it's been a little pond, and it's been a big gulf, and it's been a very large sea. At one time, the shores of the Gulf of Mexico reached to southern Illinois. And at one time, the Gulf of Mexico was only a fraction of the size that it is today. Where I live, at one time was under Gulf waters, and of course that's where we get the Floridan aquifer is from that extinct marine life from when the seas, of course, retracted. And the Floridan aquifer reaches all the way over to eastern Mississippi and up to Georgia and southern South Carolina.
Well, that's interesting. Hopefully, parts of the Gulf won't be underwater anytime soon due to sea level rise. We'll have to maybe have a different conversation about that another day. But let's talk about just kind of the bounty of the Gulf. I know you also wrote about the bounty of the Gulf, and just Gulf seafood and how it plays a part, such a leading part in people all across the Gulf's lives, and how it has been maybe overfished in many ways, and give us your perspective on Gulf seafood over time.
Yeah, sure. So Gulf seafood really starts with the original human occupants or inhabitants of Gulf shores, such as the Karankawa over in your parts, and the Calusa, and the Timucuan, and others. On this side of the Gulf, the Calusa lived nowhere else. They were not nomadic people, yet they were not an agrarian culture. They didn't need to be. They stayed put in Southwest Florida in that estuarine environment, and that's what supported them. They didn't need to hunt. They rarely hunted land animals. What they hunted was offshore. It was in the estuaries. And anthropologists estimate that 95% of the protein in the Calusa came from those estuarine environments, along, of course, with tools and material that went into the construction of their homes, and so these, of course, were people who lived their lives around the estuarine environments. Interestingly enough, as I point out in the Gulf, the Spanish occupied the Gulf of Mexico region for some 300 years, but never developed a seafood trade. And of course, as I write in the book, many of the early quote unquote explorers who were really conquistadors starved to death over in your part of the Gulf of Mexico, because these seafaring people were really came from interior Spain. These were not fishermen, and they didn't know anything or very much about harvesting seafood, even when their life depended on it, literally.
Wow.
And but the Spanish were more interested in the products of the land rather than the products of the sea. The French were here, the British were here. The British started to get into a little bit into a commercial seafood trade, but they didn't occupy the Gulf long enough to develop any sort of industry. So that was left to enterprising Americans. But everybody, who left a written record of the Gulf of Mexico, left a record about how, just rich the bounty was, how thick the waters were with marine life, in particular fish. And so when the Americans started fishing commercially in the Gulf in the early 19th century, you have to realize that the Gulf was untouched. Certainly Native peoples had an impact, which was evident in the shell mounds that existed all around the Gulf of Mexico. But in many ways, the Americans were starting with a very fresh environment, because first of all, most of the Aboriginal people were gone by then because of warfare and disease, and so they were no longer, or very few, the Karankawa were one of the exceptions, were harvesting Gulf waters anymore. And but for many years, and one thing we don't see as much today is that many Americans, the Gulf was their kitchen. It was a place where they went to go get their own food. It sustained them, even those who were not involved in the commercial fishing industry. And so people who knew something about harvesting seafood, either commercially or for subsistence, never had any problem. There was always plenty of seafood life. But even today, my audiences are often surprised to learn this. The Gulf of Mexico remains one of the richest estuarine environments as a whole in the world. And it's extremely productive, remarkably, it's still an extremely productive commercial fishing environment. And it's one that the commercial fishery in the Gulf of Mexico will in some years outperform the entire east coast of the United States. That's from Maine on down to South Florida. It's the most popular saltwater fishing hole in the United States. And so despite the pressures we've put on that environment, particularly those estuarine environments. And so it's a really remarkable place despite how much we've depleted its marine endowment.
Yeah, so we have the same struggle here in Galveston Bay, or the same maybe balance. We have still incredible productivity. We've got our shrimp and our oysters and our crabs and incredible recreational fishing, and we're balancing all these multiple uses, but still manage to have a pretty healthy estuary here. So I think we're a good indicator for the whole Gulf. Just as a reminder, maybe to people who joined us a little bit after we started, we've got everybody on mute simply because we have so many people. We are going to have time for question and answers, maybe in about 10 or 15 minutes. We're going to be using the chat feature, and we'll have somebody from GBF to lead that discussion. So Jack, you've got a lot of coverage on sort of some of the states around the Gulf of Mexico, and each of us have our own relationship with the Gulf, different in many ways. And certainly you made a reference to this too, the Western Gulf being different than the Eastern Gulf. And our side of the Gulf has had significantly more influence from oil and gas, and maybe, I know we don't have a lot of time, but just touch briefly on sort of the good, the bad, and then maybe the ugly of oil and gas, particularly post Deepwater Horizon. The Gulf is sort of recovering together because of Deepwater Horizon. I don't know that we've ever, in some ways, we've never been so unified, but obviously it came from real tragedy, and we're still recovering.
Yeah, and I think I point this out in the book. I think the only thing good that's come out of the BP oil spill is that more people have started paying attention to clean Gulf water and their own nearshore waters in their neighborhood, and are very concerned about a repeat of that happening. But they've also taken notice of how beautiful the Gulf of Mexico is, and what it has to offer beyond oil. Of course, the good, bad, and the ugly. I have to say that I devote 2 chapters specifically to the history of oil exploration and extraction in the Gulf of Mexico. And I really found that history fascinating. I didn't know much at all about it until I began writing the book. And those of you who've read that chapter know that there are some really great characters in the history of Gulf oil exploration and extraction, both in Louisiana and Texas, of course. And you just can't beat some of them. But, the good is, it's really hard to say what the good is. And I really tried to be objective in writing these chapters. I mean, there are a lot of people whose livelihood does depend upon the petrochemical industry or the oil industry, particularly in Texas and Louisiana. And people have steady paychecks that they didn't have. And of course, you're as familiar as I am with the bad, and you suffer chemical spills virtually on a daily basis in Galveston Bay and up near Houston, and you're the site of the first offshore oil spill or overwater oil spill in the Gulf of Mexico, dating back to 1918, and maybe it was 1916. No, it was 1918, and so it's just has never stopped. There's a lot of talk about overfishing, but I'm not saying and of course there has historically been overfishing, and I talk about this in the book, but it wouldn't be nearly as bad if we protect our estuarine environments. They would be much more productive than what they are. And of course, the oil industry has not in any way helped the productivity of those estuarine environments. It's done just the opposite. So it's hard for me to offer a good side other than, the economic side. But that has diminished in the economic industry itself, and that is, of course, the commercial fishing industry, as well as, which is today a $5 billion sport fishing industry in the 5 Gulf states. Could be significantly greater. And this idea that oil platforms are, of course, serve as artificial reefs. I talk about that in the book, and there's clearly a downside to that.
Well, so let's talk maybe, let's turn towards something we think is positive, and that's the efforts by groups like the Galveston Bay Foundation.
Yeah.
Talk about your experience, not just with the Galveston Bay Foundation, but I know there's lots of local groups out there. There's regional groups, there's even Gulf-wide groups. Talk about what you've seen, the positive changes that you've seen from those efforts.
Well, it's those groups that really give me hope for the future of the Gulf of Mexico. They really began organizing in the late 60s and 70s. Many of them, those are still around. When those bays were on the verge of death, all around the Gulf of Mexico, those estuarine environments, not only because of industry, but also because every municipality on the Gulf of Mexico was dumping raw sewage into those very waters that drew people to the shore, but not just the local municipalities, but those upstream, those up the rivers. And as you know, a healthy river is as important to a healthy estuary as what's going on in the nearshore areas. And so it's really heartwarming to see that virtually every inshore, nearshore body of water, bay, bayou, sound, has at least one group such as yours, and in some cases multiple groups. I don't know how many groups Tampa Bay, for instance, has supporting its good health. And hardworking people, if they are employed with one of those groups, they're underpaid, obviously, and I'm sure I'm hearing a rah.
Yeah, that's right. All of us are very underpaid.
We're not hearing it, but I'm sure it's going on. But the thousands, tens of thousands of volunteers around the Gulf, they're indispensable to the health of the Gulf industry. They're on the cutting edge. They know what the Gulf needs. The Gulf doesn't need seawalls. What does it need? Even in this era of sea level rise, what does it need? It needs to restore the living shoreline, and there's just a win-win. This whole thing, this Ike Dike, just drives me crazy. And others may have a different opinion, but I don't think the Army Corps of Engineers should be allowed to build anything larger than a bridge. There's no institution in this country that has done more damage to the environment single-handedly than the Army Corps of Engineers.
Certainly the Everglades is a good example right there. I mean,
what's that?
The Everglades is a good example.
Everglades, they've killed it. The Everglades isn't the Everglades anymore. They've turned a beautiful, natural, solar-powered system, as Marjorie Stoneman Douglas called it, to a fossil fuel-powered system. So it's groups. We are just, I am so grateful. You guys are my heroes. And it's not just simply about birds and fish for you guys. It's about the human condition as well. You recognize that human health is directly connected to ecological health, and our quality of life is directly connected to the ecological health.
Yeah, absolutely. And incidentally, we do work with some Tampa folks. Peter Clark and Tampa Bay Watch is
Yeah,
a
yeah,
good partner and
yeah. They
friend.
are great folks. They are.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I know we talked about how you would have a hard time sort of predicting the future of the Gulf, and I won't ask you that. But just what do you see as our next set of challenges as we move forward from here? And then after this question, we will open it up to question and answers through the chat feature. And I'm going to have Claire lead that.
Well, I think the great challenge is to obviously sea level rise, but what you're going to be combating is the traditional view, which comes right out of the Army Corps of Engineers and other groups, to prevent the pouring of more and more concrete. Seawalls don't work; they don't stop erosion. They contribute to it. Concrete. What does concrete do? It doesn't absorb carbon. It discharges carbon for up to 1,000 years. And so the Ike Dike is not going to be a carbon sink like an estuarine environment is. So I think the challenge is to expand in this age of sea level rise, to expand, first of all, educate people on the value of the living shoreline and expand the restoration of those living shorelines. It's a win-win-win with living shorelines, and I'm preaching to the choir here. They're carbon sinks, they're nurseries, they're birthplaces, and they are buffers against intense. How can you do any better than that? You certainly can't do it with any sort of human-made contraption.
Yeah, and I think we've been in the business of restoring wetlands and oyster shell and oyster reef and seagrasses for many, many years, and specifically have a couple of people who work on both small scale and larger scale living shoreline projects. So one more question for me, and then I'll open back up to the folks. You mentioned the Galveston Bay Foundation and Jim Blackburn in your book. Jim was one of our 3 founding board members, and he's actually a mentor for me. When I graduated from law school, I went to work for Jim Blackburn, and learned about the Galveston Bay Foundation through him then. Are you in touch with Jim, or tell us about your?
No, I'm not in touch with him. And when I was writing the book, I tried to get in touch. I wanted to interview both him and Diane Wilson, and I could never connect with them. And I can't remember what the issue was with Jim. Could it have been a health issue?
I think it's probably just that he's so darn busy.
Yeah, maybe
it's hard to pin down. He's still working on a lot of things.
I really wanted to interview the both of them, and so unfortunately, like some others around the Gulf, I don't. And many people that I did interview, I do have still have, and I am still in touch with them.
Well, we will promise to put you in touch with Jim when you come visit us to talk more about this book.
That would be fantastic.
Diane's a little bit further down the coast, but we know Diane too. So, all right. So Claire, I think I need to unmute you. Are you good with asking some? Hold on, if I can do this right. Claire, there's some questions.
There we go.
Yeah, hey.
Hey.
What do you have on the chat?
Yeah, some came through. So one of the questions was, somebody became fascinated by the perspective of your book, by the concept of the Gulf Coast as a frontier, like the Western frontier, in the interior of the US. In modern times, they've become fascinated with the extent of which this still feels true in some of the more inhospitable areas of the coast, like the Everglades or the Delta swamps of Louisiana. Why do you think there was never much cultural impact in the American imagination about this frontier?
Yeah, first of all, I would say that it was a Euro-American frontier. Obviously, there were people living here on the Gulf of Mexico who'd been here anywhere from 8,000 to 10,000 years. So for those folks, it was not a frontier, not by the time the Spanish started showing up. I get that question a lot, believe it or not. Why was this quote unquote American frontier, why has it been written out of history? Why is Florida, not part of the larger historical American narrative? Why is it all about New England and Virginia or the Chesapeake region? I think that largely has to do with the fact that our part of the what is now in the United States was originally Spanish territory, and if the English had settled the Gulf region first, I think we would have been that region would have been better integrated into the larger American historical narrative. Historians have begun to correct that somewhat. And for both the Southwest, west of you, and the Gulf region. But I think it's that people get caught up in the traditional historical narratives that were written by Anglo-Americans. And so they pretty much ignored the Spanish territories.
It's interesting just in terms of I mean, I think there's so many ways to discuss this, but I mean, just even Texas, right? I mean, Texas has a huge coast, but most of Texas is away from the coast. And like most of Texas, they don't really think of Texas as a coastal state, but we are, if we're not a coastal state, I don't know what is. But we have that sort of challenge for influence and discussion even within the state of Texas. Why is the coast important? So I get it. It just makes a lot of sense. Claire, sorry.
Yeah.
No, you're good. One more we had was, you say the Gulf of Mexico affects everyone in the United States. How so?
So, well, and I write about this in the book, if you look at there are the rivers that drain to the Gulf from the lower 48 drain over 60% of the lower 48. So you're connecting people from Western New York to Southern Canada and all the way over to the Rocky Mountains with the Gulf of Mexico ecologically. Historically, I write about this in the book. I mean, there are just numerous ways in which the rest of the country or the continental U.S. is connected with the Gulf of Mexico. First of all, to give you one quick example, Louisiana Purchase of 1803. We all read about that in the textbooks, but what do we read? What are we told? Jefferson wanted to land that deal with Napoleon because he wanted all that land west of the Mississippi, which would have doubled the size of the United States. But Jefferson was equally interested in control of the Gulf of Mexico, control of the Mississippi River, because he and every European power that operated in North America knew whoever controlled the Mississippi controlled trade in the North American continent. What he paid for all that territory west of the Mississippi, he paid double for New Orleans, which was one of the major seaports on the continent at the time, and certainly in this region. He believed the Gulf was rightfully an American sea, and he believed Cuba should belong to Americans. He advised every president after him to try to acquire Cuba, because if you had Cuba, you had the gateway to the Gulf of Mexico.
We have another question. In your research for this book, did you come across any records or history of a monk seal species inhabiting the Gulf Coast?
No, I did not. Maybe somebody has evidence to the contrary, but no, of all the species I write about in the book, that is not one.
Somebody else asked a question about the Gulf being urbanized. What do you think is the appropriate role of the city on the Gulf Coast in the future of the large cities that have grown up here?
Well, I think that cities have to be very aware of where they are planting themselves or expanding, and in terms of the environment, and understand all these connections. You cannot just simply go in and turn a river or a creek into a concrete culvert. And I think that cities, that they also have to be aware of building in harm's way. They just can't approach building on the coast with the same hubris of the past. And I think they need. I don't think I don't think there should be any more construction on barrier islands anywhere along the Gulf of Mexico. And I write about the Galveston hurricane in 1900 and talk about what others generally don't talk about when they talk about the hurricane, is how Americans said, we're not going to let nature defeat us. We're going to stay out here on this island instead of moving our city into the mainland. And what we're going to do is we're going to raise this island 7 feet. You can't even get any more arrogant than that, right? And so I think we have to be humble when it comes to building in any environment. But again, be very much aware that even if you're not building right next to the shore, what goes in the ground ends up on the shore. And what goes in the streams and the rivers, what goes in the aquifer and so forth.
Yeah, and we just people love the coast, right? So they want to be at the coast, and that's part of our problem. Is the coast is such a wonderful place to be. People want to live there, recreate there, visit, and sadly, in some cases, sort of love it to death. So
yeah, exactly.
I think we may have time. Claire, do you have one more question, Claire? Otherwise, we will probably again sort of keep this as a tease and look forward to Jack making a personal visit.
Yeah, I have one more from our good friend Jean, and I'll read this one verbatim. In this book, I was impressed with the history, intrigued by the science, and amazed by the depth of detail. But this was a way better read than a textbook. You can really write, dude. Best book I read last year. Where'd you come by that talent?
Well, thank you, Jean. I appreciate that. Well, first of all, as I pointed out, I think I pointed out, writing this book was a labor of love, and my goal from the very beginning was, look, I love this line in my talk, so I'm not going to give it away. But I had no interest in writing an academic book. I have no interest in writing for my colleagues. A very, very limited audience. I love my colleagues. I appreciate them. I admire them. But that's not what this book would not have had the impact. It wouldn't have even had a chance to win a Pulitzer, which I had no expectation of that happening, by the way. If I'd written it as an academic book, I wouldn't have reached that audience. Where did I learn? I'm completely self-taught. And I was just determined with Marjorie Stoneman Douglas' book and with this book to reach a broader audience than my academic colleagues. So when I read good writing. I have very little tolerance for academic writing, believe it or not. And when I read good writing, and when I read that writing, I'm studying it. I'm paying attention to how people write, how they construct sentences, how they organize, what word choices they make. And I like to stick, have a number of writers who I'm loyal to because I really appreciate their writing and it inspires me and influences my own writing. So thank you again, Jean. That was my goal, to write a book that people would appreciate.
Well, and I didn't even mention it myself, but it was in all our marketing materials. But yes, Jack did win a Pulitzer Prize for this book. So just fantastic. Jack, let us thank you again for being here. Tell us when your next book is going to be out. You said it's about bald eagles, and we'll look for it for sure.
Yeah, I have to say, I'm thinking it'll either be out in 2021 or two.
Okay.
I'm turning it into my same publisher, and Norton, who did just a wonderful job with marketing and obviously production too. I had nothing to do with the cover of the Gulf book. And when they first showed it to me, they wanted my opinion. I said, don't change a thing. It's beautiful. And so my plan is to turn it into them in December of 2020. This coming December. And then generally it's about a year after that before a book comes out. I'm on chapter 6 of 9, and I am just having the most wonderful time writing about the cultural and natural history of this bird. It's much as with the Gulf. There are many, in writing the Gulf, there are many surprises, have been and will continue to be. Not soon enough for me.
Yeah. Well, hopefully everybody on this Zoom call has actually read your book, but if not, there's still opportunity to go out and buy it. And then when you come visit us in person, we'd like to get a chance to get some of these signed as well.
If you have copies, bring your copies and I'll sign them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
All right, Jack. Well, this has been a real pleasure. Again, sort of an awkward setting compared to in person, but as you said, we're all familiar with Zoom at this point in time. So I think it's gone fairly smoothly. I just want to thank everybody for joining us here tonight as well. And we will look forward to meeting you in person sometime down the road, and also look forward to the next book. So thanks again. This was a real treat, and we'll see everybody soon.
My pleasure. I enjoyed it.
Okay. Thanks all. We'll talk soon. So long, Jack.
Bye-bye.